Okay, so this is a Texas history lecture on the Texas Revolution. Texas Revolution, I think, actually begins in Anahuac in 1832. Traditionally, and for some of you who are watching this video, some of you on this Zoom call are going to think, well, doesn't it begin at Gonzales in 1835 because you have a sign hanging up in your dorm room or your apartment or your house that says, come and take it with a star on it, or come and take it with a cannon on it, or come and take it with a gun on it, or something like that. Probably an AR-15 if I had to guess. But all that to say is that if you were to pin me down and say, where does the Texas Revolution begin? I think it begins actually at Anahuac and not Gonzales. So I am not alone on that statement. I think, however, I'm in the minority. I'm pretty certain I'm in the minority. But the reason I say the Texas Revolution, I think, begins at Anahuac in 1832 and then kind of smolders along for the next few years has to do with the fact that at Anahuac you find principal players in the Texas Revolution, and in addition to that, you're also going to find the major issues of the Revolution there in Anahuac. I will give a brief summary of the Anahuac disturbances in 32, and then we'll move on and get into the more closer on stuff of the Alamo and on we could go. So what happens at Anahuac in 1832? Well, I think to be clear with regard to the Revolution, I think there are really two major I guess you could call them channels, just like, and I've described this in American history this way. Two major channels that are going to cause the Texas Revolution, like channels of a river. You know how the Ohio and the Missouri help form a much larger Mississippi River. Or, you know, say if you're from the San Antonio area, San Pedro Creek flows into the San Antonio River and it gets bigger. However you want to say it, there's confluences in these channels. In Anahuac, however, you're going to find about maybe three of them. I said two, but really I think three. At Anahuac, you're going to see, first of all, you're going to see the politics of the Texas Revolution there. Number two, at Anahuac, you're going to see the cultural differences of the Texas Revolution there. And number three, the personalities of the Texas Revolution will be borne out there at Anahuac. So one of the individuals we'll mention rather quickly and get the personalities out of the way at Anahuac, because this, what I'm about to say, is really kind of a shortened version of a longer lecture I've given over the years. At Anahuac, the real principal individual there is William Barrett Travis. William Barrett Travis. Namesake of Travis County. Obviously, you know him far better if you know him at all, and I assume most of you have heard of him because maybe some of you went to a Travis Elementary or have a Travis Elementary in your old school district. But anyways, Travis is famous for the Alamo and dying at the Alamo. Travis in 1832 is not much older than you are right now. And so keep that in the back of your mind. So some of you are probably not 18, but maybe a few of you are in 19 or 20 territory. Travis at Anahuac is about 22 years old. And Travis, at age 22, has already lived quite a life. That man has, in a sense, packed more into that little short life of his than most people pack into 2 or 3 generations of there's 2 or 3 decades of adulthood. Travis is going to grow up in Alabama, Clark County, Alabama, and he becomes a writer. He becomes a school teacher. He impregnates one of his students. In addition to that, he is also a lawyer. And he's a failure as a teacher. He's a failure as a lawyer. He's a failure as a writer, at least in the sense running a newspaper. He was a third-string newspaper in a 3-newspaper town, and he wasn't a good husband because he had problems. And I might have said it before to you, 18-year-olds can, and some of you may have grandparents or great-grandparents who are married at age 18 or 20 and live a full life all the way out to, till death, and were married 50, 60, 70 years, whatever the number would be. And there are those examples. But there's also plenty of examples of 18-year-olds getting married in especially the United States, that part of the old borderlander culture that Travis comes out of, and it blows up like a blowfish. The woman's name is Rosanna Cato, C-A-T-O, Rosanna Cato. And she will bear Travis 2 kids, one of which is certainly Travis's. That's the boy Charlie. And the little girl, there's a lot of speculation that Rosanna had other boyfriends, and this was was having an adulterous affair while she was married to Buck Travis. By the way, William Barrett Travis's nickname is Buck. We don't know why he's called Buck Travis. I mean, we just know that that's what people called him, either nicely or not nicely, I guess you could say. But Travis is going to get himself into trouble there in Alabama. He gambles a lot. He's an inveterate gambler. I'm not going on jihad against gambling. I do have my qualms with it because I've been gambling and I've seen what it does to people. But at the same time, it's probably not a good idea if you don't have a lot of money to go gambling. And I don't mean going to a casino. I mean playing cards. He gambled a lot, lost a lot of money that way. He also had a problem with the fact is that he had a problem with being a lawyer. And so in that sense, he was also like being a newspaper man, a third-string newspaper guy, and now a third-rate lawyer in a three-lawyer town there in Clark County, Alabama. And then last but not least, he was a womanizer of the first order. That man got around the block more times than the ice cream truck. So the thing is that when you talk about, yeah, that's just one of my expressions. If I haven't used that one before on you. I got that one from a friend of mine in Weimar, Texas. Anyways, he always said, yeah, so-and-so got around the block more times than the ice cream truck. Anyways, when it comes to Travis, that's true. By the way, he kept a diary, and thankfully we still have the diary. And this is a historian why I hope all of you keep a diary in juicy and good detail. For good, bad, or indifferent, so other historians can read it later on and say, well, this was what it was like to live in America in the pandemic age of 2020. And so you keep that diary out there. I did this, I didn't do that, or whatever. In the case of Travis, he talked politics in English. This is after he moves to Texas. Travis moves to Texas in 1830, basically 1831, early 32. And he talks politics, whether it's American politics or Mexican politics, Texas politics in English. But for matters of the heart, el corazón, I guess, the matters of love, he basically is going to write in Spanish. And so I don't think I'd say this in English, so I probably ought not say in Spanish. But let's say it like this. There's a word for, I'm going to use a synonym. There's a word fornicate. There's another similar sort of word for fornicate. But anyways, all that to say is he in his diary one night in 1833 said he was talking about his conquest, and he was about 23 or so again at that point, I guess. He said that he had fornicated with the 56 en mi vida. 56 en mi vida. So, I mean, I don't know. I'm going to ask anybody here speak Spanish. What does 56 mean? You can type it in.
60.
That's that?
60?
No, it's 56. I see somebody typing over there. 56. Thank you, Lawson. He had, by the age of 23, had been with the 56th woman of his life. So he worked at an exhausting pace. In addition to that, he got himself a case of venereal disease. He got a wicked case of gonorrhea. No penicillin back then, so it was a problem. And so he'd complain about in his diary about the venereo muy malo. And then he complained about going to prostitutes and they were too cheap. And on we can go. So next time you see a picture of William Barrett Travis at the Alamo and he's, standing proud for Texas, which he is, of course, the thing is, keep in mind he's a very human individual. And so we find him in Anahuac in 1832, back to the disturbances. We find Travis in Anahuac because Anahuac, by the way, do y'all know how to spell Anahuac? I keep saying the word Anahuac, but I assume you did. But that's probably only assuming if you're from Houston and have driven to, typed in. And it's, if you were driving, toward Beaumont, Port Arthur, and Louisiana. But Anahuac sits on the opposite bank, or across Trinity Bay from the mouth of the Trinity River. Anahuac is a duty port. If you're bringing goods to Texas in 1832, you had to pay duty at Anahuac. So that made Anahuac a town. The man at Anahuac, the colonel at Anahuac, worth mentioning in your notes because he's a bit of a martinet. He's really not a great commander. In fact, actually, what's his name? Stephen Hardin is going to give a pretty good little discussion about him in that video. Colonel Juan Davis Bradburn. He's worth noting because you see the last name Bradburn and you figure he's an Anglo, and that's right. But he takes the first name of Juan. He changes his name from John to Juan. So anyways, all that to say is that Juan Davis Bradburn is the commander there at Anahuac. And one of the ways, once Travis moved to Texas, and so I'm clear about this on Travis, I'm not done talking about the man personally. He ran away from his wife. He ran out on her in the nighttime, basically ditched her and abandoned her. And so Travis is not exactly Mr. Husband of the Year material. And so he ditches his wife, ditches his children, runs out on debts, on and on I can go. And that's why he comes to Texas. Travis is in Anahuac, however, because he's also a lawyer, and Anahuac needed lawyers. And Travis is a good enough lawyer to make good enough money in Anahuac for port business or other business related to the Mexican legal establishment. Also worth noting, too, is that Travis is going to have a slave, though it's not called a slave in Mexico, by the way. It's that indentured servant stuff. In addition to that, Travis is also going to help round up runaway slaves in Texas and send them back to the United States. Long story short is that Bradburn is opposed to slavery. Bradburn is opposed to Travis. Travis is a loudmouth 23-year-old or 22-year-old. And I know none of y'all have ever met a loudmouth young man or a young woman. It doesn't happen that way. That's bygone. People have changed so much. But anyways, Travis was a loudmouth. And he and Bradburn got crossways. And so the thing is that the reason I make this a deal about Anahuac is that Bradburn, put this down in your notes particularly. When you talk about Bradburn, not only is he a transplant to Mexico, but his political leanings are opposite that of Travis. In Juan Davis Bradburn, you have a faction in Mexican politics that is represented now in Texas by this man, the Escoceses, also known as the Centralist. Let me write that in your notes. So when we say Escoceses Centralist, I'm using two names to describe the same political party in Mexico. Far more often than not, your textbook or other historians are going to refer to the party of Juan Davis Bradburn, later Santana, Anastasio Bustamante, and a handful of others. They're going to describe them as centralist. But the first name they took was Escoceses, which means Scottish or Scottish Rite. I would write that down, Scottish Rite. Now you're thinking, why are they in Mexico? Why is a group calling themselves the Scottish Rite? Well, that's a political term. Excuse me, it's a Masonic term. The Escoceses, or Scottish, let me write this in. The Scottish Rite is a body in the Masonic Lodge, the Freemasons. And so, I mean, for example, I mean, you've probably seen me, sometimes when I move my hand or I hold them like this, you'll see this ring, and some of you probably have noticed it, just maybe watching it go by. Maybe you've seen it in class early on, and you say, well, what is that? I'm a Mason. I'm a Freemason. And the Masonic Lodge was extremely active, so we're clear about this. I'm an American Mason, so it's the Masonic Lodge in Mexico versus the United States, a little different. But in Mexico, the Masonic Lodge was extremely active in politics. Please put that in your notes. For the Escoceses Centralist, their lodge, if you want to say it like this, their body is the Scottish Rite. They are in favor of centralized government in Mexico City, hence the term centralist, centralized government in Mexico. So the Scottish Rite, the centralists, are looking to consolidate power in Mexico. Put this in your notes too. The Escocese Centralists are also the same fellows who are going to write this most hated law of April 6th of 1830. Most of you have seen or will see in your studies and your preparation what's called the Law of April 6th of 1830. That banned, at least for a period of time, Anglo immigration into Texas. That was a Scottish Rite Centralist law. However, most Texans, in fact almost all Texans, are not Scottish Rite Centralist. Most Texans are what are called Yorkino Federalist. Yorkino Federalist. Most Texans, in fact probably 95% of them, most people who lived in Texas, regardless of where you come from, whether you're Tejano, meaning a Texian of Hispanic descent, if you are a Tejano, even if you live in Behar or in Goliad, you are politically a Yorkino Federalist. in all likelihood. There's exceptions, but the rule is you're a Yorkino Federalist. Almost all, like 99% of all Anglo-Texians are going to be, in this time period, are going to be Yorkino Federalist. Texas is extraordinarily a one-party state. William Barrett Travis is a one-party man. He is a Yorkino Federalist. He plays that side of the aisle. And Travis and Bradburn lock heads politically, not just in personality. They lock heads in politics. Anyways, to move the story along, Travis tries to send some slaves back to Mexico, back to the United States that were supposed to be captured. Bradburn has the slaves under his own house. There's a fight ensues. Travis is arrested. Patrick and the Jack brothers are going to be arrested. When it's all said and done, Bradburn is recalled back to Mexico. Travis is the victor of the moment. And by the way, put this last part in your notes, this might be the most strange to the whole thing, is that Antonio Lopez de Santana, or Santa Anna, if you're used to 7th grade history, but in that Anahuac disturbance situation, there was also a political race going on, which heightens the imagination of the era, heightens people's issues and complaints. And so Travis is a supporter of the Yorkino candidate for president of Mexico in 1832. And that man's name, a Yorkino Federalist in 1832, that man's name is Antonio Lopez de Santana. That should surprise you if you know Texas history a little bit, because if Wells is furling up his brow because he's probably used to thinking and hearing that isn't Travis at the Alamo and it's Santana outside the Alamo trying to kill the Texians in the Alamo in 1836? Yes, that's exactly right. The thing to understand about Santana, and it's in the lectures in eCampus, but the thing about Antonio Lopez de Santana is that he is unpredictable. And that might be the most charitable thing I can say about the man. He is unpredictable. Because in Santana, some days you find him, especially early on, as a Federalist. Then later on, he becomes a Centralist. But in 1832, Travis, at the end of his ordeal, he comes out successful. He hosts a party. It's almost like a Biden for president rally or a Trump car caravan party. And Travis, who, by the way, put this in your notes, did not drink alcohol. He did everything else under the sun but refused to drink. That was his one vice he would not do. And so Travis hosts a party and says to anybody who wants to come, especially soldados in the garrison at Anahuac, Bradburn soldiers, come to the party for the Yorkinos. Come to the Santana victory party. They got them all drunk. They all declared themselves as Yorkinos, and Bradburn runs and had been recalled. So the Anahuac disturbances hit on about 2 or 3 things. One, like I said before, you're going to have these major characters and names present at Anahuac. Travis one, Santana's another. You're going to have the political issues of Mexico in a very closed environment in Texas. The Centralist Escocese versus the Yorkino Federalist and their headbutting as well. In addition to that, you're also going to see this other part, really kind of a cultural angle, the idea of rebellion, the idea of say, ignoring and violating Mexican law. Because actually by law, Bradburn was completely in the right. But by cultural custom, an Anglos taking up arms, and more particularly an Anglo dissenting rather loudly against a military government, or a military governor, that's very Anglo. That's very American, North American. And it's those are some cultural issues right there. So if you're to take it back out into the larger scale, what causes the Texas Revolution? I think it's going to be essentially, you boil it down, 2 things, cultural and political. Cultural and political. Anglo versus Hispanic. On the one hand, neither side particularly loves the other at times. They have their own prejudices against each other. And then politically, Mexico's got lots and lots of problems. So let's move on. Let's get to 1835 now. Let's take this and have ourselves a setting here in 1835. So the next time period I need you to put in your notes is October of 35. October of 1835 is extraordinarily important. It's kind of a crowded month. And what I mean by a crowded month is you find Gonzales taking place, come and take it, and then you find the Texian people massing up into an army, and then they march on Behar in the same month. So when there are times that you look at history and it seems like everything's quiet. Yet, like right now, at the time of this recording, is what, 2020? Has this not been a crowded year? I mean, you started out with March, and you have that pandemic bust loose and everything that goes with that. Then you have the summertime of 2020 where you have marches and protests and this and that and some violence. And so it was a crowded year. And here, very recently, you've had had Trump and his entourage come down with the COVID itself, and basically seemingly is the third act of a three-act play. It's a crowded year, is my point. October in 1835 is a crowded month in Texas. But before October of 1835, you did have a sea change that took place. And sometimes events will force people to reevaluate their positions. I want you to be extraordinarily clear in your notes to this effect here. That at the outbreak of the Texas Revolution in 1835, especially in the summer of 1835, before we really had the shootout at Gonzales, as things are breaking loose in 35, there were many Texians, I got to say it correctly. There were many Texians who, in the summer of 1835, were opposed to independence from Mexico. Most Tejanos, please put that in your notes, most Tejanos in the summer of 1835 are opposed to independence from Mexico. Most, I would argue, in fact, probably 2/3 of your Anglos, maybe closer to 3/4 of your Anglo-Texians, those who would be found in central Texas or around the city or the town of Gonzales or out toward Anahuac or East Texas and San Augustine and Nacogdoches. The thing is, at least 2/3 and probably 3/4 of your Texian Anglos were opposed to Texas independence. Yet it came. Why? Why does it come? Well, some of it has to be the persistence of what is known as the War Party. The War Party will be made up of individuals you've already heard of before in your life. James Bowie, William Barrett Travis. Let me think here just a second. Those two are easy, prominent names. James W. Fannin also as well. But the reason most Tejanos and most Anglo-Texians are opposed to independence in 1835 until October of 35 is that most Texians had skin in the game. What I mean by skin in the game is that, let's say for argument's sake, if as I'm recording this, Lawson, who's sitting there listening diligently and thinking, he's like, what? He'd lived in Texas all, say, 10 years of his life. He's, instead of being, 20 or so, 18, Lawson, you're about, you're about that right now? Okay, I couldn't hear a thing, actually.
I'm 19.
You're 19. So let's just say you've lived in Texas for 10 years, make you 29 or 30, and you got yourself a head right of thousands of acres of land, and you'd worked that land and turned it into a productive cropland and productive ranch land along the banks of the Colorado River, along the banks of the Brazos River, wherever you want, I don't care. But you poured blood, sweat, and tears into the thing. And then you have these hotheads like Travis and Bowie, who has got a reputation, good and bad, trying to whip up a frenzy for war against Mexico, which has got its problems politically. Yet what happens to you, Lawson, if you lose, if you throw in with revolution and you lose the revolution? What happens to your land?
I lose all that land too.
You're going to lose all that land, and you're probably either going to be stood on a wall and shot, or you're going to be driven out. So understand this. For everyone who had possessions in Texas, they have to factor into the calculations. Say, coming into the summer of 35, during the summer of 35, do I support rebellion? Well, they may support independence of Texas from Coahuila. That's one thing, but still Mexican. But do they support rebellion? Because if you go to do that, if you go down that fateful road and you lose, you're probably going to lose a lot of things. And there is plenty of anecdotal evidence that it'd be that even those who were not in favor of rebellion, just because of who they were associated with, because of where they came from, the Anglos, that they might lose their land regardless. So it behooves you, if you've already spent years working in Texas, building up something, have become prosperous perhaps even. You're not going to want to just throw that away on some sort of wisp and dream of revolution. Yet it still comes. October 35, you start to see the sea change taking place. Why? Several reasons. Number one is that when we we talk about this road to revolution, and what radicalizes people is you're going to have more disturbances at Anahuac. A second set of Anahuac disturbances in June of 35. And guess who was there? William Barrett Travis once more. However, in June of 1835, that second set of Anahuac disturbances goes over very poorly. Most Texians, regardless of ethnicity, whether you're Tejano or Anglo, are going to say, Travis, you're in the wrong. Travis, your actions at Anahuac, which was over it was a reaction against a local commander. Most Texians blame Travis for the problems. He's the hothead. He's the revolutionary. He's the war dog, as they called him at times. However, put this next man's name in your notes. Martin Perfecto de Cos. Martin Perfecto de Cos. Let me spell that for you. Martin, if you're just spelling it in English. Perfecto de Cos. He is to me, he's a bit of an enigma, but he's a Mexican military commander. He's a colonel, some lower general. You find him in Texas in 1835, and Cos is sent to Texas to kind of root out the malcontents, like the Travises and the Bowies of the world, perhaps. Certainly the Fannons and others that would be problems for Mexico consolidating power and reasserting power in Texas. After Anahuac number 2 in June of 35, Cos basically said, I don't care what you Texians think, especially you Anglos. I don't care what you say. I know this. Who's causing trouble in Texas? It is the Anglos. And so there's beginning to be this worry amongst Anglo-Texians in the summer of 35 that no matter what we do, or more particularly what we say, is going to help us with the Mexican government, despite the fact that many Texians will plea in writing, we are loyal to Mexico. We have no interest. We have no part with the war party. So Anahuac number 2 boomerangs back in the face of the Mexicans, from what Cos says. Number 2, Martin Perfecto de Cos is going to call for and receive more troops to Texas in the summer of 35. More troops to Texas. Now, you may claim to be peaceable, and you may very well be peaceable, but when more troops start showing up in your neighborhood, and you may try to be claiming to be more peaceable, if you're Cos, who says you have nothing to worry about, and at times he says that publicly, yet more troops come flowing into Texas from the interior of Mexico, wouldn't that send shivers up your spine particularly, or at least potentially? It should. And so when the Texians receive reports, sometimes real, sometimes frankly embellished, that there are more troops coming to Texas from Mexico, that starts radicalizing more and more Texians, especially Anglos. Number 3. The third major event on the road to the outbreak of full-on violence in 35. In July of 1835, you're going to have a courier pouch intercepted outside of San Augustine in deep East Texas. This courier pouch, give me a second here. Somebody's trying to chime in on me. But anyways, this courier pouch is going to contain some very explosive information. Quite illegally, James Bowie steals this courier pouch from this courier. The courier left it in East Texas, somewhere close to San Augustine, and then he went and took it back to Nacogdoches. In July of 35, Bowie opens the pouch dramatically there in Nacogdoches, deep East Texas, and Bowie reads it. You never know what you're going to get if you open it and you don't know what's in there, but Bowie reads it. And this courier pouch is from El Presidente Antonio Lopez de Santana, who had been previously been befriended by Texians. This courier pouch says, in July of 1835, I am going to arrest the leaders of the war party. I'm going to arrest the leaders of the war party, including William Barrett Travis. Now, in America, in the United States, what happens if you get arrested? And more particularly, what happens when you go to trial? It's pretty clear in the federal Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, that if you have a trial, you will be tried in the area in which you are to be tried, area which the crime was committed. In essence, so let me just say it like this. If I commit a federal crime, and we're talking national level stuff now, if I commit a federal crime and I say, well, where's this trial going to take place? It would take place in Texas, and more particularly in the district. So maybe this would be in the Houston district territory. However, you have no such assurances under the Mexican Constitution, which had been shredded by Santana by 1835. So where is Travis going to be tried at? The answer is going to be in a secret trial in all likelihood down in Mexico City. Down in Mexico City. So Travis will not be tried. Bowie will not be tried. Other prominent names of the war party will not be tried in Texas. They will be tried in the heart of Mexico and put on trial, and probably a secret trial. And a lot of Texans said, that's radical. That's crazy. That's tyrannical. And so that scares a lot of Texans. They got their cackles up. And the last major step on the road to war, in the sense of full-on fighting in 1835, happens in September of 1835, right before October, of course. And that is, it's about September 8th, 10th, somewhere in that neighborhood, the arrival in Texas of Stephen F. Austin. Please put that in your notes. Probably nothing else is bigger than this one right here. Up until this point in time, the war party had been a minority. Up until September of 35, even with all I just rattled off to you, Anahuac 2, more troops in Texas, the Courier Pouch incident, and others that I skipped over. Even to that point in time, the war party was a minority in Texas. But when Stephen F. Austin returns from his imprisonment and house arrest in Mexico City from basically 34 and 35, well, 33, 34, and now 35, Stephen F. Austin comes back, and up until then, Stephen Austin had been, please put this in your notes, had been a peace man. Stephen Austin had maybe the most to lose, in a sense, by breaking with Mexico. But by September of 1835, Stephen F. Austin had come to the conclusion that, oh, by the way, we must break away from Mexico. We must gain our independence from Mexico. When Stephen Austin, the great leader of the Texian Anglos, and just simply in a sense the father of Texas, when Stephen Austin cast his lot with the war party, that says to a lot of others who were perhaps starting to waver in their commitment to Mexico and to peace at all cost. When Austin when he tilts and he says, it's time for war, it's time for rebellion, it's time for independence, that sobers a lot of Texians up, and it changes the dynamic, and there you go. It's time for a lot of Texians. They reassess, and they go and they basically start to say, you know what, we need to start talking about independence. And the war party grows, and it grows quickly. Then in early October, you have the events at Gonzales, which was a minor affair in the scheme of things. It was a skirmish. One Texian broke his nose. A couple of soldados got killed in the shootout over a little old small cannon. And if you've ever seen that cannon at Gonzales, it is nothing impressive. In fact, actually, you see it in Gonzales in the museum in Gonzales. It's about this big. Exactly, it's about this big. But it's more like it's like a glorified shotgun. I wouldn't want to get shot by it, but there's a good chance it wouldn't hit you. But it was given by the Mexican government to the folks of Gonzales to protect them against Comanche Indians. I referenced that in a lecture last week. The Comanches giving problems to Green DeWitt and his colony. However, when the Texians, especially the Anglo-Texians, but also Tejano-Texians there at Gonzales, bow their neck up and say, you can't take it, or to use the phrase they actually use, come and take it, that is absolutely seditious in Mexico. whether they're talking about politics or culturally, that is absolutely seditious. Because under Mexican law and before that Spanish practice, the government has the absolute right to take away weaponry in this case. You don't have a right to say, you can't touch it. By the way, at about the same time, a similar sort of event took place down at La Bahia and close to Victoria, where it was actually at La Bahia Goliad, where a cannon also had been given to protect against Indian attacks, and the local, which was predominantly Tejano, gave it back without incident. So there's that cultural issue that's playing in the background. The politics of Santana and the rickety politics of Mexico. And the Anglos, to be clear, who are holding on to their Anglo-cultural identity. And I want to make one other note before I jump into the Army of the People. But one other note you need to note politically about Texas, culturally about Texas, and those Anglos who were in Texas. Why was it they held on so dearly? Why was it that it held on so dearly to their cultural habits? Well, some of it is it's ingrained and learned. I grant you that. I see you, Wilson. I saw the question, Wilson. I'll answer it in a bit. The thing is that it was ingrained. It was learned. But put this next part in your notes. Why was there this Anglo determination to hold on to our rights, our liberties, as they defined it? Well, some of it has to do with geography. Geography. So most of you who are on this, who are watching this video, this Zoom call, your ancestor comes probably, maybe most of you, half of you, I'd have to do a head count here, but most of you come from overseas. And what I mean by that, like Giesenschlag is not from South America. Giesenschlag is from Europe. I mean, it's about as German as Schmidt or Klein. But the thing is that some of you will take your lineage from Scotland, others from England, others from France, others from Romania, or maybe China, maybe Vietnam, maybe somewhere else, Australia. But here's my point, is that even though you have the United States as the nation of immigrants, which it is, the thing is that you have from Germany or England or France or wherever, you have this Atlantic Ocean that is going to act like a cleaver and is going to help cut that cultural tie. What I'm saying, geography matters in that, yes, you have American Germans or German Americans or Romanian Americans or English Americans who are going to look back and say, yeah, we have this cultural practice, we've done it this way. However, you've crossed an Atlantic Ocean, you've crossed a Pacific Ocean. And that itself forces you to cut loose of the homeland to a certain, maybe a large degree, especially prior to picking up and doing a Zoom call or picking up the phone and calling back to the old home country. You only wrote a letter and it took forever to get there if it got there. However, the Anglos in Texas in 1835 and 1836 have no issue with geography. Their geography is, well, where's the Anglo culture? Right across the border in Louisiana, Arkansas, and so forth in the United States. That culture is still right there. So you put that into the mix, and there is that fierce determination amongst the Anglos in Texas to hold on to their cultural practices, their cultural habits, their liberties, as they would say. So it's all a combustible mix. You have the politics, you have the culture, you have the geography, you go on down the list. It's quite extensive. The best place I would say that I've ever seen it described in far more concise terms than I'm willing to go to at this point is in a book called Gone to Texas, written by Mike Campbell, or actually it's going to be Randolph Campbell. He does a great job of concisely explaining it. Your textbook would do a decent job as well. The thing, though, is that once the shootout takes place in October at Gonzales, that has a galvanizing impact upon many Texians. Many Texians, especially Anglos, are going to flock to the proverbial banner, and they establish, put this in your notes, what's called the Army of the People. The Army of the People. The Army of the People is, in other words, the Texian Army. The Army of the People. The general of the Army of the People is Stephen F. Austin. Now, Stephen F. Austin, I think very highly of. I think he's he's probably as good of a man as you're going to find in Texas for the time period. He was a lot of things, and he did a lot of things well. A general was not one of them. But the reason Austin was picked as a general was because he was one of the few unifying figures that was out there. It was not going to be Ed Burleson, at least not initially. It was not going to be Sam Houston. Sam Houston is, in his own right, is problematic. It's not going to be James Bowie. It's not going to be Fannin. It's not going to be others. But the Army of the People, meaning the Army of Texas, is going to come together in a very democratic, small d, very democratic method. One of the individuals I do want to point out in this Army of the People, and I want you to understand how this fighting and these actions by the Mexicans can radicalize individuals who would be normally peaceable and be in favor of Mexico, staying with Mexico. Put this man's name in your notes. Erastus. Now, I hope none of you ever consider, and I did for one night, and I laid down and I woke up again and it went away, but Erastus, never name your boy Erastus. Erastus Deaf Smith. Now, you probably have seen Deaf Smith or Deaf Smith County. They all pronounced it Deaf. They didn't pronounce it Deaf. But Deaf Smith was he was an Anglo who moved to Behar in about 1821-22, and he married himself a Tejana, and he had a family and a good amount of land, several hundred acres, as I recall, maybe a little more than that, actually, down south of San Antonio, close to, basically, as I understand it, close to Loop 410 South. So those of you you're familiar with San Antonio, the south side of San Antonio, that's where the Deaf Smith territory was. But Deaf Smith, his ranch and his warehouse, and I don't mean this like a big Amazon warehouse or a Walmart warehouse, I mean like a warehouse for goods for the family, got raided, his hogs killed, his cattle taken, and he was a peaceable Mexican citizen. Yeah, he was Anglo, but he was married to a Tejana, and he did everything right. And the Mexican army, Martin Perfecto de Cosa's army particularly, they raided his storehouse. And Deaf Smith is going to say, basically, I can't live in a nation that would do this and I can't stay loyal to a nation that would do this to a man and family who is loyal to them. I won't put up with it, and he joined the Texian Army of the People. Becomes a great scout, by the way. That's really one of the more important characters that's in the Revolutionary Army. But the Army of the People doesn't just have Stephen F. Austin as a general. I want you to put this in your notes now. It's a democratic army, small d, an army of democracy. So they elected, so we're clear about this, and this is an old Anglo tradition, goes back, actually predates America, but it's really common in the 1820s and 30s. They elect their own officers. You want to be a lieutenant, you want to be a captain, you want to be a colonel, you get elected by the outfit or elected by the army or so forth. So how does one go about getting elected? Well, frankly, you go about getting elected by, amongst other things, getting your soldiers drunk. I mean, literally, they would buy kegs of whiskey or intoxicants, and they would ply their voters with booze, and it would get them drunk. So the Army of the People at times was half drunk. And so Holden just got mugged. Sorry, Holden. We'll see you later, buddy. Good luck. And so I guess, no, are you okay? Good. All right. So, well, at least you're still standing. I mean, he was acting as, for those of you not seeing this on the screen, he was reenacting Erastus Deaf Smith gets attacked, sort of thing. So, all that to say, though, is that the Army of Texas is a rambunctious army that was drunk half the time. A lot of these young men are, well, 20 and 25 years old, and what do young men like to do? They have adventure, go on a frolic, go get drunk, and playing it in the army sounds like a good idea. And so they make up, and they eventually get down to San Antonio, or outside of Behar, I should say more correctly. And this now is in November of 1835. And this Texian army is supposed to lay siege to Behar. So we're clear about this. The geography of San Antonio is going to play a role in this siege of Behar here in November and early December 1835. Now, you may think that the Alamo, particularly the Alamo Fortress, is in downtown Behar. It's not. In the time of the Revolution, the Alamo actually sat on the east side of the town. In fact, about a mile or so outside of town. Behar itself, the Villa, the town sits where, if you're familiar with downtown San Antonio, San Fernando Cathedral is. And so understand this, when you gotta, if you're familiar with San Antonio, one of the problems you might have is you might imagine it with all those houses and all those tourist traps all around the Alamo and everything there. But at that time, remember, the Alamo is going to sit out really on a prairie, on a blackland prairie, just on the edge of the hill country, and the city or the town of Behar or San Antonio is to the west, just by about a mile or so. Anyways, the Texians, the Army of the People, is forming a siege around Behar because they weren't strong enough to knock it over, at least not initially, they didn't think, and they didn't want to just walk away either. The problem is most of these men, as November wears on, it's rainy. Put that in your notes. It's a rainy November. It's a disagreeable November. It's just kind of cold and damp and dreary in Texas in November of 35. And you've got people coming into the Army, people leaving the Army. Sam Houston showed up one day and tried to convince everybody to run away. And then he got drunk and tried to kill himself. I don't know if you ever heard, if you ever heard that. Sam Houston was a bit of an alcoholic. But anyways, and he leaves in semi-disgrace. You'll have people, Travis comes and leaves, and on we can go. But in some of these little minor skirmishes around Behar, one of which was at Mission Concepcion down at the confluence of the San Pedro and the San Antonio rivers, or San Pedro Creek and San Antonio River at the confluence, there was a shootout. But I want you to make a note of this, and this is going to be a problem for the Mexicans in their war against the Texas rebels, is that Mexican gunpowder was horrible. It was horrible. And when I say horrible, what I mean by that is that if anybody pulls a gun, let's be honest about it. If one of you pulled a gun and were trying to defend your apartment or house or condo from somebody kicking in the door in the nighttime, you're not going to, if you're smart, you're not going to be waving the gun around. You're going to be ready to use it. You don't wave it, otherwise it's just going to be taken away from you. So you take your gun and you're going to use it against rebels or robbers or whomever kicking the door in the nighttime. You pull the trigger, snap, bang, and you want the bullet to go into the man's chest and him fall over dead or be stopped. The problem for the Mexican army was their gunpowder was so bad, it was recorded in the battles around the skirmishes around Mission Concepcion that more than a few Texians got shot in the chest and the bullets bounced off of them because the gunpowder was so bad. There was so much corruption, literally and figuratively, literally in the sense that there was corruption in the making of the gunpowder, and then figuratively corruption in the kickbacks and bribes that went into the making of the gunpowder, that a lot of Mexican soldados had no confidence in their weaponry. All long story short is this, is that the siege almost fails. The siege of Behar almost fails because Texians wanted to fight, yet they didn't want to fight, yet I can't make you fight. Stephen F. Austin leaves. The general of the Texian army by December 1st, 1835, put this man's name in your notes. His name is Edward Burleson, B-U-R-L-E-S-O-N. Now, Edward Burleson is, well, the namesake of my county, Burleson County, but Edward Burleson is an old Texas Ranger. He's a frontier fighter. He's a surveyor from the Bastrop area, or Minna as it was called then. Anyways, he's a sort of man that people followed. They did, but they wouldn't follow him into San Antonio. And the problem with the siege was it was failing. Men were going home. The Texian army at its height had 1,000 men in it. By the time you get to December 5th, 1835, it's now got down to about 700 men or so. And Burleson announces the day before, he says, we're going to go. And everybody said no. And then he said, fine, we're going home. Into history, into Texas history, unless you take a very deep dive. But into Texas history, Launch is another name for another Texas county, and that man's name is Benjamin Milam, M-I-L-A-M, Milam County, right down the road from here. Milam County, Benjamin Milam was an old hand in Texas. He'd been in Mexico for years, gotten arrested half a dozen times, land speculator, pot stirrer, and a half a dozen other things. But he's also charismatic. And when he heard that Burleson was calling off the siege and telling the army to go home on December 5th, 1835, Milam was mad. He was absolutely, it was actually December 4th, 5th is the assault. 4th, Milam is mad, and he marches into Burleson's tent, and everybody who was around there stopped what they were doing, and they listened, and they could hear these two men cussing and screaming at each other, or yelling at each other. After about an hour of yelling and cussing, out comes Ben Milam, and he stands up and he says in front of everybody who would listen, "Who will go with old Ben Milam into San Antonio? Who will go with old Ben Milam into San Antonio?" And that dramatic event, these Texians are not moved by a cold logic, but by emotion and heart. These Texians, Tejano and Anglo alike, are going to say, "I will, I will." And the next day begins the assault on Behar, and that's where we'll pick up in the next class when we get to go. We'll get the assault of Behar. In fact, actually, I'll say it like this to you. Go ahead and, hang on a second, let me